Welcome to our family history virtual class today. Our subject is What's in a Name? Given names and surnames of the enslaved ancestor. Paying close attention to both. Until the end of the Civil War, most slaves were identified publicly by only a given name. Slaves on the same plantation were distinguished by the slaveholder based on the slave's age, size, or color. Old Jim, Young Jim, Big Moses or Little Moses, Yellow Sam, Copper Sam, or Black Sam. However, this practice does not mean that slaves limited themselves to the names given to them. Within their families and communities, they followed their own naming practices, which remains a common practice in the African American community today. The slaves' discretion to name their children varied from slaveholder to slaveholder. Slaveholders with many slaves were more likely to be involved in naming newborns than those with few slaves, perhaps to prevent confusion that could result from the overuse of the same names. Repeated use of names was likely to be found in family groups. However, if the parents chose a name, they probably only did so after the slaveholder approved. And this citation is from A Genealogist's Guide to Discovering Your African American Ancestors by Franklin Carter Smith and Emily Ann Kroom from page 106. Excellent book. I suggest that if you're really trying to research your enslaved ancestors, that you get it. It's an excellent resource. So here's an example from my own family tree. This is my seventh great-grandmother, Hartwell Hardy Goodrich Hodges, and this is her second husband, James Drake, and this is his will. And you'll notice in item 1 that he gives and bequeaths to his beloved wife, Hartwell Drake, for and during the term of my said wife's natural life, my yellowish Negro wench, Nancy, and her issue begotten. And after the death of my said wife, I give and bequeath the said wench Nancy and her issue to my beloved son, John Drake, and his posterity forever. So I looked up, what does yellowish Negro mean? And from the site Mustees, Half-Breeds, and Zambos in Anglo North America, it says by J.D. Forbes in 1983 that these were cited, that he was a yellow fellow, part Indian and part Negro, and then just later it gives some more examples of how they used yellowish Negro in describing African Americans during that time period. And so I just got from it that apparently it's not an African American that is fully black, and so maybe they're part Caucasian and part African American, or part Native American and African American, or just not 100% African American dark. So that was interesting, but that can be helpful, and we don't love the label. But as you're looking through different wills and you see yellowish Negro Nancy, then you can go, hey, I wonder, especially if it's in the same family or maybe even neighbors or an in-law, you can have a more sure bet that that is probably the same enslaved individual and be able to follow her trail and be able to trace her ancestry and trace her forward as well. Both before and after the Civil War, a person's given name sometimes varied from one record to the next. The differences may have resulted from the way that the family reported the name, like Matilda or Tildy or Tilly. Maybe the family pronounced the name, and thus the way each clerk or census taker heard it was varied. And the recorder maybe chose to spell the name differently. And occasionally families used nicknames in public records. Now, on this screen, I've used a part of my family tree. So the Richard Blunt is my sixth great-grandfather, and his will was done in 1774. Arthur Davis was the man who administered his will and then married his widow. So that was interesting too. So Arthur Davis's will was done in 1790. Separate wills, but both wills mention the following enslaved individuals. Sion, they both have Sion in there. They both have Esther. They both have Enki. One will said Jim, One said James. I'm thinking that's the same person. One said Nan. The other said Fanny. And just remember some of the things that we just learned about the way names are reported. So it could be the same person. And we're going to stay on Nan or Fanny for a minute and pop up to the top. You'll notice that I wrote Mary Throwermore, who is my sixth great-grandmother, who was the wife of Richard Blunt, and also the wife of Arthur Davis. And then she was married to a Moore, and I don't have his name right in front of me, but that was her first husband. When she passed away, her will was done in her first husband's last name. So go figure. I don't know. Maybe he was the favorite of all three of her husbands. I don't know. But in her will, she mentions the enslaved woman Nanny, and she wills Nanny to her child. So I think this is interesting. I'm wondering, is Nan or Fanny and Nanny, are they all the same person? Did that enslaved woman go to all three of these people? I wonder. I think it's a strong possibility. And then the last enslaved person, its name that was in both Richard and Arthur's will was Jack. And so I think it's really important to keep track of which slaves were in which will in the families, and see if we can come up with a trail that will help bind families together now, so we can help African Americans find their great-great-grandparents and such, and learn their stories. And again, this citation came from just a source from page 108. Okay, on to surnames. A common and often erroneous presumption is that most freed slaves took the surname of the most recent slaveholder. In fact, the surname may have belonged to a prior slaveholder, the first or the favorite or the longest, or the slaveholder of a parent or a grandparent. Even in these 18th centuries, many slaves had surnames and carried them from owner to owner, although few slaveholders knew or acknowledged or used these names. And this is again from that great book that I told you about, page 108. Surnames, things to look for and think about. Now, this is from a different book. I went to Roots Tech just this last year. It was awesome. And I went to Jeanette K.B. Daniels' class. She's a professional genealogist, and I bought both of her books. One of the reasons I bought it is because I recognize some of my family's surnames in that, and I think it's going to be a great help to me to unravel some of my family tree. But this is from the first volume that she did, page 184. So she says, number one, the final surname that a freed slave picked may be that of the plantation owner where he was born. A slave surname used on a larger plantation to separate slave family groups, or the surname of the last owner. The surname will usually lead to pre-1870 genealogical records in most cases. Number two, there are freed slaves, such as Frederick Douglass, that ended up with a surname that had nothing to do with his previous life in slavery. And without family sources or tradition to explain what the slave owner's name was, it would be difficult to trace him or anyone who completely changed his name. And number three, tracing the white owner's extended family, neighbors, and friends may become necessary in order to trace the movement of mortgage slaves or buying or selling of slaves. So as I was researching, in my family tree, I have Llewellyns and Drakes. And on Ancestry, someone had downloaded the Llewellyn letters, and they are from a collection that's called the Ellen Landers collection. And it's not just Drake and Llewellyn letters. There's quite a few. She does, I think she has 6 generations. And so several different surnames are in there. So I copied off all of these letters. There's 120 pages. So fascinating to read. I colored all the names of the enslaved people in those letters and who they went to. And then after I went to all that work and hours of reading, I thought, oh my goodness, I don't have a source. And so I looked for the source, and sure enough, East Texas Research Center at the East Texas University had the Ellen Landers collection. And I was able to contact them and pay a very nominal fee. I think it was less than $15 to get a digital copy of the handwritten letter of my ancestor and the envelope that it was addressed to. And then this is the back of the picture. The next slide is going to be her actual picture. But this is just really fascinating, this particular letter. So this is 30 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And this enslaved individual, Lacey Drake, contacted her former slaveholder family, the Plewellens, and asked for some financial help. And so I just thought this was fascinating, and I'm going to take some time and read you that. Let's go over here. So Edward Archelaus Plewellen was writing to Lacey Drake there in the middle, and on the back of that photograph, that's her, on the back of it, it was handwritten Aunt Lacey Drake. And he is referencing Frances Caroline Plewellen, and she is my second cousin 6 times removed. But I just thought this letter was fascinating, so I'm going to read this to you aloud. And this was written in March 28th, 1897. Dear Lacey, some time ago I received a letter from you requesting that some of the family send you a little help. Well, I carried your letter to Thomaston and gave it to Martha Weaver and asked her to show it to Mariah and other members of the family. I was in Thomaston yesterday, and Martha and Mariah both handed me $1 for you. To that amount, I have added $2, making $4, which I send enclosed herewith by money order. Now, when I read that, I was like, gosh, what a cheapskate. But my husband and I looked up what $4 during that time period would equal today, and it was $120. So that made it feel a little more generous. Cousin Fanny Carey or any of your white friends will explain what you will have to do to get the money from the postmaster. All of our contributions are small, but will help you some. None of us have any money to spare, for times in this country are very tight. This country is in worse fix than it was soon after the war. I want to say for Mariah that her husband, Beale, is a hardworking man, but has made no money for several years. On the contrary, he has sustained considerable losses, and his expenses have been considerable. The death and burial expenses of her babe and surgical treatment of herself have required the expenditure of a considerable amount of money. She went to Atlanta and had one of her eyes out, and is now wearing a glass eye in its place. You know that from her very birth she has had great trouble with her eyes. The only good eye that she has was operated on for cataract about the close of the war. She suffered so much with the eye that it was cut out, and that it had to be removed to prevent the other eye from going out. Her health is now greatly improved. Mr. Weaver has been sick for several months. He's not been out of the yard for many weeks, but is a little better now. He has a large and expensive family. Martha's in good health, but is kept very busy looking after the household. I went to see Dr. Drake and wife yesterday. It's a sad place to visit, but the doctor has been paralyzed for several years. He's almost helpless and can't talk so as to be understood, and it is with great difficulty that he can eat anything without being strangled. My Aunt Mary Ann has become partially blind, can't read nor write, but can see enough to get about the house and attend to her domestic matters after a fashion. It is hard sometimes with them too, and I'm afraid it will be worse. They have but one son who is able to help them. That is Jimmy, and he has given their parents much trouble. He has a considerable family of his own to take care of, and some of the boys are drunkards and have given their parents much trouble. John was a drunkard for several years, but has become sober and gone to work. Archie is the worst of all. His wife has quit him and is now suing for divorce. Blue has been drinking so much that he's lost all of his good jobs of work and is now in Richmond, Virginia, doing little. Ed Drake is at present at his father's. He never has been dissipated, but somehow has been a failure in all of his efforts. I don't know what to say about the old colored folks of the family. Nearly all of the old ones have either died nor moved away. And I know but little of the young generation, as I have not lived in Thomaston in several years. Kinchin Drake and wife are both dead, but their children are still living in and around town. Deaf Jim Carey and his folks are still on hand, and Lizzie Drake and her daughter Molly and her son Jim also living in Thomaston. And none of them have made much headway. There are other colored members of the family scattered around, but I can't call them to mind. Hoping that your health has improved and that you are getting on well, I close with my kindest and best regards. All of the white folks of the family in Thomaston send their kindest regards. Not being certain by what name you are known, I send this letter in care of Cousin Fanny Carey. So in my family line, the Fluellens and the Drakes married each other. And so this is an example of how, even though at the end of her enslavement period, she was enslaved by the Fluellens, earlier on, she was enslaved by the Drakes, and that's the name that she chose to use. So there's a case in point of what we just talked about. Okay, finding slave owners. So number one, freed slaves can be traced back into slavery times. Number two, it is important to trace freed slaves back as far as 1870. And with that location and information, you should be able to come up with ideas of which white families were the most likely to have been the owners of your slave ancestors. And this is from the source that I just talked about, African American Genealogical Research, Volume 1, by Jeanette K.B. Daniels, a professional genealogist, page 184. Okay, I don't know if you are familiar with the couple of classes that I've given in the past, but a couple of classes ago, I talked about how I became involved in the research of enslaved ancestors. So my DNA cousin contacted me, and we just had the most amazing journey and developed a very strong relationship. And she introduced me to yet another cousin. And I've even briefly been introduced to other cousins via, the internet. Hope to meet all of them in person someday. But Kathy and I were able to go on a trip, and it's absolutely been an amazing journey for me. So I am the descendant of slaveholders. But I do share the DNA with those who have enslaved ancestors. And so these people are very important to me too. And I love them and want to help tell their stories. And so I wanted to share some things that I found out and reasons why it would be good for you to get your DNA tested. And if you find out that you do have slaveholders in your family, get your information out there. So this Richard Talley Dozier was born in 1779 in Richmond, Virginia, and died in 1855 in Georgia. And this is his will, and it's a very unique will. And I was able to transcribe it with the full text that's now available in Family Search. And they announced this at Roots Tech, and it's in the FamilySearch.org's labs. And so you can take a handwritten document from this time period, which is very difficult to read, and it transcribes it with some errors, but not too bad. So I was able to kind of clean it up a little bit as far as spelling errors or English errors. But this will was really fascinating. It's good if they list the enslaved person's name, but this will list not only the enslaved person's name, but the enslaved person and who their children are, which I think is quite a gold mine. So with the second item, he says, I give and bequeath to my beloved wife, Lucy, my Negro man, Bill, and my Negro man, George, my Negro boy, Isaac, my Negro girl, Martha Ann, and my Negro girl, Courtney, and my Negro boy, Moses, and their increase. And then as we go down a little farther, he's giving to his children. So he's just named single people thus far. And he's giving to his children, and it says who his children are, and that's important to know who he's willing them to. So you can look in their documents and see if you can find these enslaved people's names. He says, so to all of his kids, and he says the following named Negroes: my Negro man, Henry, my Negro man, Jack, my Negro girl, Dicey, my Negro girl, Charlotte, and my Negro girl, Beach, or maybe Beth, and and then it's either Beach Ann or Beth Ann. My Negro girl, Mary Ann, and her 4 children, Sam, Nancy, Susan, and Letty, and my Negro girl, Lucinda, and her child, James. So there's some family groups there, which again is a gold mine. And then it talks about that they'll be equally divided between their children. So we don't know exactly which enslaved people go to which of his children, but we can, if we have access to their family tree, then we can look in each of those wills and other documents and hopefully find their names. So this was fascinating too. So that Richard Talley that I just read his will, this is his son, Richard Talley Jr. And this showed up in Ancestry in their hints. And then I looked it up and was able to find this in the Library of Congress. So this was done in 1936. This is Lizzie Hill. She's age 94 when she was photographed and when she was being interviewed. And she was the enslaved person of Richard Talley Dozier Jr. So he is the son of the man that I just read the will of. And I thought this might be interesting to read aloud to you. So it's written in the language that she spoke more. So anyway, it says, she was of such a vigorous constitution that until recently she carried on her regular occupation of laundress or washwoman, as she calls herself. She's too feeble to work regularly. She is now cared for by a niece with whom she lives. Sitting before the fire in a rocking chair, smoking a clay pipe, and her neat clothing, snow white hair, and wrinkled kindly face make a pleasing picture of contentment. Her mind is apparently unimpaired, and she readily responds to her recollections of slavery. Sho, Missy, I remember about it. I was most grown when freedom come. My master, Richard Dozier, and my missus was good to all of us, and they raised me right. I had 2 little misties about as old as me, and I played with them all the time and slept on I think it says, not all of it is clear to read, in the room every night. They slept on a big bed, and my clothes was just as good and as clean as theirn, and I ate what they ate. And the little girls, she explained, were about 6 and 8 years old when this association began, and it continued until the close of, I can't read that last word, of when they were all nearly grown. After freedom come, continued Aunt Lizzie, Mammy moved to a Cuthbert and took me away from the old mistus. But I run away and went back to mistus and walked all the 14 miles down the big road at night. And I run most of the way. 3 times I done that. And it says Alabama. Everybody liked her. And before my little mistus got married, and then old master and mistus moved off to Texas, and I ain't ever seen none of them no more. I had a hard time working in the fields since the war. For freedom come, I remember working except in the house, and I was a house girl and didn't do no field work. And so that interview was done in April 23rd in 1937. But that is in my family tree. And this is a very distant relative, but it's all accessible to me, and I have all of this at my fingertips. So as long as I'm researching. So those of us with slaveholders in our family tree, it's time for us to join hands and share what we've got and let these precious people be known to their descendants. And so I really plead with all of those that have slaveholders in their tree to not be embarrassed, but to open up and to get this information out. And I'm just really grateful for the journey that I've been able to be part of. Okay, so these are some great places, if you do have slaveholders in your tree, to share the documents. Now, there's going to be two of the private Facebook groups that I know are really legit and really good. So on the far left, you'll see the Beyond Kin Project. In the middle, you'll see I've traced my enslaved ancestors and their owners. I've done the most work with this middle one. I don't have enough hours in the day to do everything I need to do, but I have put a few documents on there, and then also in 10 million names. And 10 million names was announced at Roots Tech. Family Search and American Ancestors are the main drivers behind this, but they've got the Sons of the American Revolution, Daughters of the American Revolution, and a lot of other folks that are just trying to get this off the ground. They want to have one huge place where people can go and recover, restore, and remember. And so truly, it says be part of the project of a lifetime. That's what I feel about being involved in this work. These people were amazing. I don't know how they went through what they did and generations of enslavement, but they were strong, and they have this posterity that needs to know where their ancestors came from. And I feel like as we join hands to do this, we can hopefully make a better tomorrow where racism isn't a thing anymore, where we're just all enjoying being brothers and sisters, Black, white, Native American, Asian, all the different races, and just enjoy being brothers and sisters and learning from one another and enjoying the diversity of all of our different backgrounds and all of our different stories. So thank you for listening. I hope you'll take the time to go to these sites if you have slaveholders in your tree. If you don't have slaveholders and you're trying to research your enslaved ancestors, I hope you'll go to these sites because it's a great place. I've traced my enslaved ancestors and their owners. When I posted things, it's kind of, it's a bit like a chat room, I guess. People respond and they ask questions, and I'm able to answer some or look in my tree to see if I am related to them, or it's a wonderful opportunity to join hands and to make this happen. So I encourage you to do it, and thanks for listening.